Good morning. Let us pray. Loving and gracious God, you are the giver of all good gifts, and we thank you today for all your blessings. We give thanks for the wonderful diversity within our city. We celebrate the Black history and the impact of the Windrush people. We ask your blessing on all our new citizens of Salford, that they may live full lives and make their own individual marks in this city. We ask for blessings on all those affected in any way by anxiety, depression, and grief, and those close to them. We remember especially our dear friend and colleague, Councillor Peter Connor, and his family at this sad time, and pray that you will surround them with your love and your peace. I pray for all elected members of this council and all employees working together for the city. I pray that they may be blessed with your wisdom, guidance, courage, and strength. Be with those assembled here today in their deliberations, and help them to be wise in the decisions they make for the good of all those who have placed their trust and confidence in their leadership. Give them insight to lead with integrity and make decisions for the good of all. Loving and gracious God, grant us all the humility to always seek your will in all that we do and say. In your mercy, hear our prayers. Amen.
Thank you. Please be seated. Item 1, announcements of special business, and not been notified of any announcements or special business. Apologies, please. Any apologies received? Yes. Thank you. Yes.
Councillor Morris and Councillor Jones.
Any further? Thank you.
Councillor Bowman.
Thank you. Thank you. Any further apologies? Item 3, are there any declarations of interest? Yes. Thank you. Okay. Any further items of interest? Can I ask members with interest, which you've now declared, minutes of the meeting held on the 10th of October. I'm sorry, to Councillor Robin Greeno. Sorry? City West. City West.
Okay.
Thank you. Minutes of the meeting held on the 10th of October 2018. Are the minutes of the meeting of the Council held on 10th of October approved as a correct record? Agreed? Receipts of petitions, communications. Do you have any petitions that need to be received? There are none. Membership of committee panels, 2018-19. Yes. Councillor Reynolds.
Oh, sorry,
City Mayor.
I'll move the report.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, this is just to move the report.
Treasury Management Strategy Mid-Year Review by the lead member of Finance and Support Services, Councillor Hines.
Yes, Mr. Mayor. I seem to remember that I made a Treasury Management report at last month's council. But just to say again and point out some of the, what I would say, the relevant parts, of course, we all know that the position about Treasury Management is to make sure that we inform members quite clearly about what our strategy is, both for investment and borrowing, and make sure that liquidity, we have enough monies there to meet our day-to-day needs. And that's what this report attempts to do. In fact, I think it shows quite clearly how that we're doing it and how cognizant we are of making sure that we meet all the for codes of practice that you can see at the conclusion. Again, there is information there about an economic update which shows the interest rates where they are and how that affects us both from a borrowing point of view and from an investment point of view. So you can see that's in good detail, but clearly quite, even though we know now that in August this year, the Monetary Management Policy Committee raised interest rates by 0.25% to 0.75%. Now, they believe that by 2021, that will go up to 1.5%. So obviously, we could have a good political discussion of whether that will come or it won't come, but that is what is indicated in the report. And in 3.2, you can see that the box there with all the interest rate provisions going forward. Again, we've under the statement, you see where we are with borrowing on our capital finance requirement, which means the difference between grants and other monies that come in and monies that we have to borrow, unsupported borrowing, which is the main part of what is an issue that we're keeping a very, very close eye on with our capital programme as we go forward. So I will do my best to answer any questions that come along, Mr. Mayor, and if they're of a technical point of view, obviously, I will get back to members. Thank you. Oh, sorry.
Thank you, Chair. Really just like to draw attention to paragraph 3 in the third paragraph in that section. And I too would like to welcome the 43-year low in terms of unemployment. That's certainly a big bonus to the country, and certainly will be a bonus to solve in the coming years. Certainly, we look at the wage inflation and the fact that this is service-led, that should hopefully result in increase in growth. So I think that's quite a rosy picture. It's not brilliant, but it's a step in the right direction. I would certainly like to welcome those figures.
Well, of course, Chair, we could have a long debate this morning of whether, you know, we're all pleased to see employment where it is in the sense that, you know, in a statistical point of view, but I'm sure that we could have a long discussion this morning on whether employment is really where it seems to be. That we all know that there's many people working in this city now and across the country at very, very poor employment conditions, wages, 0 hours, and therefore this is a statement as it is in a Treasury Management point of view, but I don't think that to you or the members relish under this report for us to have a debate on the rights and merits of what I would consider is not the best position in the world on unemployment.
Any further comments? Yes. Oh, Councillor Paul Wilson.
Thanks, Chair. I'd like to come back to the point that Robin made around employment. The government statistics are actually based on 1 hour employment, classes of employment, so let's not perhaps get too carried away with our unemployment rates. I'd also ask Bill Councillor Hines, around on page 34. It talks about there's a currently 1.5% differential in short-term rates. Just wonder if you could clarify what our policy is in terms of being risk adverse. Thanks.
You're referring to the logo?
Second to last paragraph, Councillor Hines, at the last page of the report.
I'm struggling on it on the machine.
Begins there is current.
Yeah, this is obviously the issue of where we can borrow money from the Public Works Loan Fund. We feel that that's very, very beneficial to us. So no problem in that one at all.
Okay.
Any further comments?
Move the report.
Is there a seconder? Thank you. Next is item 8. Councillor Lancaster.
In moving this motion, I make it clear I don't intend to speak for too long period of time on this, because I think it's one which hopefully most members, if not all members of the council, will support. It's a motion preventing killers from withholding the location of the victim's body through the Helens Law. For those who don't know, and I think it's in the actual report you've got today, in 1977, a killer actually murdered the daughter of Marie McCourt in February 1988 at Billinge. Since that time, Marie has actually been campaigning quite strongly to change the current law. And we were successful when the council supported it in the last occasion when it went to government for a resolution in May 2017. Therefore, a general election was called, which meant that the report and the decision to actually make this decision, Winners never taken, it was withdrawn because of the general election. We're taking the opportunity now to get it back onto the agenda of government and to make sure that Helen's Law does get passed. And we're asking in this resolution for the Mayor to write to the government expressing their concern and asking that as soon as possible time be set aside to get this decision through Parliament. It will not stop and prevent murders. What it will help is one of the prevention measures, because the criminality of murder is one thing which is bad enough, and distress is bad enough from murder on the family. But what's even worse is the body not being able to be buried and to have a religious service to actually I'm sorry, I'm getting so upset about it. To get to the situation that you actually feel as though you've not put to bed what has been a horrible murder, and you've got to live with it for all these years. It's reminded you on this, and until the burial takes place, that will always be with you. So ask the Mayor, through you, that we actually ask the Mayor to write to Parliament and express our concern about the delays on this bill, and ask them to put it urgently on the government's agenda.
Councillor Turner to second the motion.
Thank you, Chair. I have no hesitation whatsoever in seconding this motion, and I thank Councillor Lancaster for bringing it to the attention of this council. As he's outlined, I too will not be speaking too long. It's all in the motion. It's quite clear, but we do need to get behind this. It was delayed, as Councillor Lancaster said, because of a general election, but we cannot let it just drift away. It's most important and extremely important to the relatives who have been fighting so long and so hard for what I consider is common sense. This person, I believe, has been out on parole, and I really do abhor that idea. So we do have support from the Justice Minister, Rory Stewart. He has been answering a question in the Commons. So let's hope, together with that and the Mayor's letter, which I hope will be couched in reasonable terms. I know the Mayor hasn't had a great deal of success with his letters to the government, but I do hope this one will find its way, properly and urgently, because that's what it deserves. So I commend it to the Council. Thank you.
Any other member wish to speak? Yes, Councillor. Councillor Saunders.
Just a couple of brief points. Firstly, as our leader has just said, of course we support the motion on this side. I'd just like to say, first of all, obviously it won't be a panacea for all cases. You think of Ian Brady, I almost said Graham Brady, Ian Brady, who never revealed the whereabouts of his killers, of his victims' bodies, although he was never going to be paroled. So obviously in a case like that, it wouldn't help. Secondly, somebody who's had the sad task of burying a child, not through these sort of circumstances, thankfully, I can only tell you what a comfort it is to be able to visit a grave. I cannot imagine what it must be like for somebody who does not have a grave to visit. And finally, as everybody knows, Chair, I hate being pedantic, but I'd like to propose 2 grammatical changes to the motion. Paragraph 1, line 2, create, should be substituted for the word create without an S. Paragraph 2, line 6, the word it's with an apostrophe should be substituted by the word it's without an apostrophe. Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Fletcher.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I just wanted to add a little bit more to Councillor Rabbi Saunders regarding, obviously I support the motion, but it's regarding the Hindley and Bradley cases, and we all can recall Winnie Johnson, how unfortunately she went to her grave without knowing where her son Keith Bennett had been buried, and the rest of her life was totally tortured, not just by the murder of her son, by not knowing where his whereabouts were and not being able to bury his bones. So a very important motion which I fully support. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Can we now move to the vote of the motion? Agreed? Thank you. Ask those in favour, please show their hands. Thank you. Thank you. The motion is carried. Will be recorded a unanimous vote. The statement of the elected city mayor, item 9.
I'm noticing that we're well ahead of time on the schedule, so I presume that means I can speak for an hour. Okay. Good morning, Chair and members of the Council. I'd like to begin today with a series of tributes and personal reflections, in a sense. And the first is to the firefighters and the emergency personnel who've helped battle the Little Halton fire from Thursday last week. And also to the officers of the City Council who've been working with the emergency services and partners to ensure the safety of our residents. It's events such as this which remind us of the essential role played by the public sector and emergency services and their day-to-day bravery and commitment to the residents of our city. Secondly, I'd like to pay tribute to my dear friend and colleague, Councillor Peter Connor, his wife Mary and their family and friends at this time, following the tragic loss of their granddaughter Emily Connor, who has sadly passed away. My thoughts and my prayers are with him and his family at this terrible time. Finally, I'd like to pay tribute to the 744,000 British Army personnel who gave their lives fighting in the Great War of 1914 to 1918, as well as the 20 million more from nations who perished throughout that dreadful war. Many believed they were fighting in a war to end all wars, but tragically they were proven wrong, as barely 20 years later, the world plunged again into conflict that claimed 60 million souls worldwide. On the 11th of November, we remember those who have given their lives in conflict, and we honour their sacrifice and endeavour to ensure their memory keeps us from further barbarity. The misery, futility, and terror inflicted by war is so overwhelming, so intense, that only through remembering the suffering of those who have fallen can we help to bring about a peaceful future. In the words of the wartime poet Siegfried Sassoon, I'd like to remember, have you forgotten yet? Look down and swear by the slain of the war that you'll never forget. Do you remember the dark months you held the sector at Mametz, the nights you watched and wired and dug and piled sandbags of parapets? Do you remember the rats and the stench of corpses rotting in front of the frontline trench, and down coming dirty white and chill with a hopeless rain? Do you ever stop to ask, is it all going to happen again? So, following my thoughts and reflections, really, I'd like to welcome the Gadham Centre to the City Council and to the Council meeting today. And this is obviously in the run-up to Carers' Rights Day, which takes place on Friday, the 30th of November. And I'm sure many of us know in this chamber the important work that carers, and specifically young carers, do within our communities. In a sense, they are the backbone of society. Unfortunately, our carers face real challenges within society. Carers' allowances, as many of us know, are pitiful. And I know certainly my political party want to see carers' allowances increased at least by 17%. So ideally, we would like to see them a living wage, really. But also we know as a council that austerity and cuts, certainly in local government, makes it really hard for us to demonstrate, I think, sometimes, and recognise the rights and recognition that carers and young carers within society deserve. And today we're reminded of that, and I thank the Gadham Centre for being here and for obviously raising awareness about the absolutely fantastic job that carers and young carers do within society. So thank you. Throughout the early hours of Friday morning last week, I attended our now bi-monthly homelessness count in the city of Salford, along with Councillor Tracy Kelly. And the count comes after Andy Burnham's recent launch of the Greater Manchester Combined Authorities Bed Every Night initiative for rough sleepers across Greater Manchester, guaranteeing a bed throughout the winter months from the 1st of November to the 31st of March for all those who need it, providing a hot meal, breakfast, wash facilities, and access to much needed support services in some cases. The scheme is also supported. What this actually means is that resources are in place to move participants into permanent accommodation. In Salford, 42 rough sleepers were accommodated under Greater Manchester's Bed Every Night initiative on the night of the count. In addition to that, we also accommodated 20 people that night ourselves as a City Council through our own rough sleepers initiative. But however, even with the initiative of Greater Manchester's Bed Every Night and our own initiative, I was part of a group that still came across 12 people sleeping rough on our streets, without a roof over their head and without a place to call their home in the city of Salford. Currently, I'm unable to provide the full figure at this point because that needs to be independently verified, but as soon as we have that information, I'll certainly share it with members of the council. However, what I can confirm is that we counted more rough sleepers in the city of Salford than we have previously counted when we've done the annual count. And many of the people we talked to were young people. Many of them also claimed to be in work, and one gentleman had been sleeping rough in the city of Salford for over 4 years. And I'd like to also pay tribute and thanks to the Manchester Evening News, because I think they did a really good job of accounting for what happened on that night, and they joined us as we went round the entire city. And I think if anyone's read the article, it is a thorough account of what happened on the night of the count. Nevertheless, for me, this is indicative of a failing system, and we know the homelessness epidemic is sweeping the nation, alongside a wave of austerity and destruction of our social safety net. Increasing numbers of ordinary people, people with jobs and families, are finding themselves in precarious positions without a roof over their heads and a place to call home. And earlier last week, our government was lambasted by the United Nations rapporteur, Professor Philip Alston, for the damage austerity has done to our society. A shocking indictment of 21st century Britain, with 33% of children living in poverty. With Professor Alston describing it as not just a disgrace, but a social calamity, an economic disaster, all rolled into one. Visiting 9 towns and cities across the UK, Professor Alston noted, "During my visit, I have spoken with people who depend on food banks and charities for their next meal, who are sleeping on friends' couches because they are homeless and don't have a safe place for their children to sleep, who have sold sex for money or shelter, children who are growing up in poverty, unsure of their future." These are shocking accounts, but they tally entirely with our own research taken in Salford and the work of the Poverty Truth Commission. In late October, we launched the second Salford Task Force research paper detailing the lived experiences of what is often referred to as hidden young people in our city. Hidden young people are not in employment, education and training, eligible for benefits but not actually claiming them. They are not recorded in the government statistics of those claiming unemployment benefits. They are not tracked by our benefit system, and they are not eligible for funding for training provided by government schemes. And to all extent and purposes, they live outside the parameters of the system. Our research found that hidden young people are primarily care leavers or young people with learning difficulties. Often they claim that the punitive sanctions regimes imposed by the job centre humiliate them out of claiming their entitlements. And many prefer to live hand to mouth, working in cash-in-hand jobs and in the informal economy. Some of them have even turned to petty crime just to make ends meet. And in Salford, we estimate that there are as many as 2,000 hidden young people who have been exposed to risks, insecurity, poverty, squalid living conditions when they should receive support. Many have even been homeless and slept rough on our streets. Just imagine a decade from now when many of these teenagers have grown up into adults. Imagine the damage that is being caused in their formative years to their self-esteem, their confidence, their experience of work, and their aspirations for the future. As the social contract is broken through austerity's pervasiveness, crime is increasing, especially violent crime, and a deep enmity is being built up in many communities that are being disenfranchised. At the heart of so much of this trauma is a lack of available and affordable housing. The private market will not, and seemingly cannot, provide for the needs of the people of this city. That's why here in Salford we'll be building our own council housing through our own in-house company, Derive. But we cannot do so at the scale needed to solve the housing crisis. Although government has relaxed the borrowing cap on the housing revenue account, governments still continue to incentivise right to buy, making it almost impossible for local authorities to build at scale without risking their investments. In a paper I commissioned through the Combined Authority, it showed that since the introduction of right to buy in 1980, Greater Manchester has seen 92,612 homes purchased under right to buy, with approximately 40% of homes purchased under right to buy finding their way into the private rented sector. And with over 85,000 people sitting on our housing waiting lists across Greater Manchester and around 13,000 social rented properties lost over the past year, the challenges to deliver truly affordable housing do not get any easier. Also, with housing associations still under pressure because of rent caps and the lack of grant, the problem in many respects is set to worsen. And to add further insult to injury, the government are also gerrymandering the national funding for housing infrastructure, putting more and more funds into wealthy shires in the south of England and the City of London. 2 weeks ago, Core Cities and the Key Cities groups representing over 30 urban areas across the whole of England jointly published a report showing the distribution of billions in housing grant and infrastructure funding from Homes England over the next 5 years. Government have adopted a methodology which calculates need based on absolute differences between median household prices and also median work-based household income figures. This formula has led them to conclude that the Cotswolds and the Kentish Downs are areas of higher need than anywhere else, such as Greater Manchester, Birmingham, the north of England, and even the Midlands. With only 4 local authorities, that's Trafford, South Lakeland, Hambleton, Harrogate, eligible for 80% of this funding. When the data was published alongside a map of the country, it became clear that the methodology skewed resources into rural areas and the south and southeast of England. Other government funding pots have come with similar methodologies. the recent social housing funds released by Homes England had eligibility criteria which again left the north of England high and dry. And only yesterday, Helen Pidd in The Guardian reported that following analysis of the latest government figures released on Tuesday, and 4.5 years after the Northern Powerhouse agenda set by George Osborne, the then Chancellor, transport spending per person has gone up twice as much in London than in the north of England. London, it's increased by £326 per person, whereas the north is less than half at £146 per person. This evidence does really start to question the government's commitment to rebalancing the economy and also their commitment to the northern powerhouse. What this means is choosing to inflate asset price further in the south rather than providing real, truly affordable housing here in the north. So back in Salford, where we do have a real housing crisis on our hands, the problem continues to grow. Since 2001, there has been a 108% increase in the private rented sector in our city. And since 2008, there has been 391% increase in the use of bed and breakfast accommodation, temporary accommodation in the city of Salford. The average private rent for the city is now at £756 per calendar month, completely unaffordable for many of our hard-working residents. Why is this a problem, you might ask? Well, if you look to the task force paper, Poverty in the Private Rented Sector, which shows the private rented sector increasing within the city of Salford, it also conceals widespread squalor, poor conditions, high rents, and really poor practices from some of our landlords. Large numbers of tenants in this sector live surrounded by mould, damp, and cold. The evidence base speaks for itself. Many suffer from landlords who do not respect their right to privacy, fail to fix facilities in good time, or treat their tenants with basic respect. And often tenants live in fear of retaliatory eviction, unable to enforce their rights through civil courts. And we must remember the biggest cause of homelessness is evictions from the private rented sector. Interviewees to our paper reported hoses for showers, walls so damp with mould they fell through, and cold, cramped conditions in which they were perennially ill. But nevertheless, we are continuing to fight back where possible. The City Council's private sector housing team recently secured a fine of £55,000 against a rogue landlord in our city who had not supplied fire exits amidst a barrage of other failings. However, government, as we know, place an arbitrary restriction on areas of the city in which we can enforce licences on landlords, meaning that our powers are constrained in the city. For tenants in those areas, their only recourse is through private courts. So, no housing money for the north means fewer genuine alternatives for residents currently struggling in a private rental market. But as we know, government cronyism doesn't really stop there. When transitional funding was announced for local authorities dealing with austerity, it was the home counties and Surrey County Council which were the main beneficiaries. When the Adult Social Care Grant came out, again, it was Surrey County Council and their sweetheart deal that ended up taking the lion's share. And when government's fair funding review was announced and the possibility of a negative revenue support grant, again benefiting the wealthier authorities of Westminster and Canterbury, the story is still the same. And when you combine this with the constant fiddling of funding that has been shamelessly practiced by this government for nearly a decade, that it's tens of millions of pounds worth of investment has been taken from Salford and stuffed into some of the wealthiest areas of this country. Despite all of this, your Labour authority in Salford has been fighting through, providing sound fiscal leadership in the face of unprecedented squeezes on resources. And with another £16 million worth of cuts to take from the budget this year, times are still very hard. But growth is strong in the city of Salford, and we see this in many different ways. In the past 2 years, we've gained over 900 businesses, 1,200 jobs, and 3,753 new homes. We've leveraged in £707 million in investment, 192 million in public investment, and 78 million of general inward investment, totaling nearly £1 billion into the city of Salford. And that's in a relatively short space of time. And as a result of that growth, our tax base is growing, helping us to protect jobs and services in this city council. And only yesterday, TalkTalk announced that they'll be moving their headquarters to the city of Salford out of the city of London. 13.5 million has been added to the council tax base in 2 years, 2.7 million in business rates and 9.7 million collected in Section 106 contributions and 13.4 million in new homes bonus. Collectively, that's an extra 39.5 million into the city council, which helps us protect jobs and services. But we know that as we continue to grow, that sends a signal to government to take more off us in the revenue support grant. This growth keeps us afloat in increasingly difficult times, and it would have not been possible without the brave spending decisions that this city council has taken historically through their capital budget. Labour has made long-term investments into the prosperity for the people of this city, and those investments are now cushioning some of the worst impacts of austerity. And unlike the Conservatives, Labour understands local government and how to financially manage it. Let us not forget the dreadful response I recently received in response to my questions to government over our 5 outstanding local authority nurseries. Those nurseries are under threat, caused primarily due to government funding formula changes to the direct schools grant. In writing to the Chancellor, I raised the issue that I still had not seen any evidence in the Minister's understanding of the distinction between nursery schools and local authority maintained nurseries. A flexible funding has been provided for one and not the other. And in response, I received a reply thanking me for my query regarding NHS funding and assured me that my suggestions were being considered. The level of contempt and arrogance and incompetency of this ruling government is seriously atrocious. And it's an appalling indictment of the Conservative Party in government. An old party with a long history, currently disgracing itself on the world stage. But for the people of Salford and the rest of the country, we can only hope that this disastrous government is short-lived. Salford needs a Labour government, and a Labour government fast, before the decline set in tow by the Conservatives becomes irreversible. Thank you very much.
Sorry. We have not received any questions with notice, therefore, do any members have questions or comments to elected city mayor? Thank you.
Councillor Gina Reynolds.
Councillor Gina Reynolds.
Thank you, Chair. Just to comment on your statement about the carers, Paul, and to say they are truly our unsung heroes across the city. And I would like to thank the Gatham Centre and staff for coming in today to put a stall on outside. As Paul mentioned, it's Carers' Rights Day on the 30th of November, and the theme for that this year is Caring for Your Future, which is about raising awareness of carers, making carers aware of their rights, and letting carers know where to get help and advice. So I'd just like to thank Paul for referencing that, and to say that we do need to make sure that our carers' needs are met.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to thank the City Mayor for mentioning the fire in Little Hulton, and I want to emphasise that thanks that go out to how that was dealt with. The neighbourhood centre were fantastic, and all the other agencies that were involved in providing some reassurance for the residents of Little Hulton. I just wanted to provide a little bit of context about why it was so important that those residents got that reassurance in that area. For quite a while now, I've been dealing with other environmental issues that have been impacting on them. We have, for a long time, had issues with Kenny's Waste Management to do with dust, smells, noise. The residents there have suffered a huge amount with environmental impacts from that business. Then this summer they had environmental impacts from the what was going on at Cutacre with the landscaping and the dust in the environment. So it was so important that they got that quick response and quick reassurance from the council. I had one resident phone me up who has been constantly on to me about the problems that they've got and the environmental issues they've got in that area, because a skip was placed right next to his garden and he could see all this asbestos waste going into this skip, and it's literally just the other side of his fence. So of course he was phoning me up in an absolute panic about that because of the experience that had gone on before. So I just want to reiterate my thanks for the response to the fire. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Hines.
Thank you, Chair. Well, first of all, could I also, like the Mayor, pass on my condolences to Peter Connor in this tragic event that happened. Well, it's not an event, tragic circumstances of a fortnight ago where his grandchild was knocked down and killed. Peter, at the moment, as we know, is going through a very, very difficult time with Mary, who is terminally ill. And like the Mayor, my prayers and thoughts are with them at this moment. Nothing could be worse than what they're going through, I don't think. So I want to just say that. Going back to what the Mayor opened up with, about the deaths of the First World War. Years later, the Second World War, the millions that have died in both of those wars. Will we ever learn? Will we ever learn? At the moment, the world is in a perilous state. As we see the rise of the far right and fascism all over Europe, and even closer to home, where hatred seems to be the theme of the day. But having said that, governments could be said to be blamed. And certainly this last 40 years, where we've seen, certainly in Britain, certainly in the United States, and in Europe, where neoliberalism has become the talk and the theme, that the economic theories that people are basing themselves on. Even if it had a day, it's certainly lost its sell-by date by now. As we see crisis not only in Britain, we see crisis in Europe, we see crisis in America, but at this moment I want to concentrate on the crisis in Britain. And I use that word crisis, and I've used it time and time again in this city council. The mayor quite adequately and illustrated the crisis of housing and homeless. There is no reason there should be a crisis in housing and homelessness. The money is there, it's just in the wrong places. It is looking after the few instead of the many. This has got to alter. We are the 5th largest economy in the world, and to be shamed at the United Nations because of the austerity. But that austerity has been based on neoliberalism. That's what it's been based on. That has got to change. Hopefully, as the Mayor has said, the only way it will change is with election, or hope for change, is an election of a Labour government. This Conservative government, only a few weeks ago, the Chancellor presented his budget, the giveaway budget. A little bit of extras for education. All those other things that he put forward. Is the government changing its spots on austerity? I don't think so. Already in the pipeline are further cuts down the line. That budget was about, in my view, a sop to the fact that there could be an early general election. It hasn't changed its policies. It doesn't know how to change its policies. Because once again, I'll say it, there's a crisis there, compounded by the government's actions over the last 8 years. But you can go further back on the policies of a Conservative government, and I'll use the word again, neoliberalism, that has got to be altered. So I endorse what the Mayor has said. There's a crisis all the way through, whether it be in health, whether it be in education, whether it be in housing, whether it be in our prisons. Manchester Prison, there was a report only yesterday where violence among staff, on prisoners, it's unbelievable. And people are closing their eyes to it. We have a crisis in transport. We have a crisis all the way through this system, with no, looks like, any way of getting out of it. So, Chair, I would end up like this. I don't know whether this government knows it's fast from its elbow. Oh, sorry.
Are there any further questions? Councillor Kelly.
Councillor Paul.
Thanks, Mayor. I'd just like to echo Paul's sentiments regarding the Manchester Evening News article that was out yesterday, and thank our staff that came out with us, our housing team that came out with us on the count last Thursday. It is always a difficult thing to do, and especially in this role, but I'd like to just say that housing is a basic need, and it is a main contributor to other inequalities, especially health. And last week, it was predominantly men that we saw out on the street. And what upsets me, as we all know, that men, it is predominantly those that take their own life. And it really concerned me about the amount of men that we see, and especially some of those in the shelters that we provide in the city. And I'd just like to thank the Narrogate and Loaves and Fishes as partners of ours that support us with some of these vulnerable people that we are supporting. Housing can be a difficult discussion, and we all have to take it that we need more housing, and that's not something that is palatable for some people. Housing stock is scarce, and therefore we need the ability to build more truly affordable housing for this future generation that we're working with. As we know, we are an ageing population. Where do our young people go if we don't even have the offer of a stable and suitable accommodation for them to live in? So we need to make more demands on the government to give us that those funds that are desperately needed, not just in the north, but especially here in Salford. Thank you.
Councillor Paul Wilson.
Thank you, Chair. City Mayor, obviously you spoke quite well today around the number of homes are lost, and you did an article in The Guardian as well. But I'm a little confused, if I'm honest, with the figures you quoted. You quoted 13,000 council homes being lost, which is 5% of the stock in The Guardian, and that was since 2012, but today you said that was in the last year. I also wonder whether this number of 13,000 homes that's been lost, does that include the asset transfer of Salix? And obviously that's quite a concern. It's something I disagreed with, was obviously giving away council houses. Where are we going to go with Salix? Are we going to, now the cap's been lifted, are we going to look to take Salix back on board? Where's our ambitious plan in terms of putting houses into Salford? I'd also like to know about the business plan for Derive and how many homes that's delivered as well. Thank you.
Councillor Guido. Robin Guido.
First of all, can I just agree with every word that the City Mayor said in terms of carers. I think we have many young carers and in fact older carers caring for members of their families, and they deserve our support and they deserve to be properly compensated for the amount of time they give up. It's not a job, it's a labour of love for many of these people, and I do not think that they get adequate allowances to cover that. I also, if I might add, disappointed in fact that there have been some changes recently that means that those carers who do that for a living, particularly those who sleep overnight, have in fact had their allowances reduced. And I would certainly support any suggestion, in fact, that that is something that needs to be looked at in the future. Can I just turn to housing? I'm not going to say a lot about it because, you know, I agree with quite a lot of what Councillor Kelly has said, and she said it in a rather less political way, I think, than we come to expect from the City Mayor. But I think it's the comments that you made, City Mayor, are all very one-sided, and the figures that you give are all very one-sided. I unfortunately don't have access to all the figures in front of me today, but you quoted a figure of an average rent of around £700 odd. I trust, in fact, when you gave that figure, in fact, you were including all the high rental properties that we have in Salford as well. So clearly, that is going to push the average figure up tremendously. My understanding, in fact, is that I'm just hoping I've got a figure here. Yeah, no, I've not got a figure yet. But I think the average social rent is more around £400 a month, rather than the average of £700, which you quoted for all rent. So I think we ought to be looking like for like and not giving misleading figures. I think the other thing that we ought to bear in mind, Mr Mayor, that you talk as if this government has not done anything, or the previous Conservative governments over the last two governments. And yet we look back to the last Labour government, where in fact the number of houses that they built during their 12 years in power was considerably less than the Conservative government has built during their recent terms of office. So I think we ought to bear in mind, in fact, that we are making great strides in terms of house building. Clearly not enough. You know, we have a big housing crisis to solve, and the government has already made it very clear that they want to move ahead with house building at as quick a pace as possible, and they've increased the amount of money available throughout the country quite substantially. So I think we ought to look at what's actually happening rather than the fantasy that nothing is actually happening by this government. And the final point I would make about right to buy, in fact, is that over many, many years, lots of people within the city of Salford have been able to buy their own home, whereas previously they would have only been able to rent that home until the day they die. Basically, it's everybody's right, I believe, to be able to choose what they live in, if possible, and to be able to have their own home, and to be able to buy their own house that may be a social housing originally. They would never have moved from that house. They were there for life as far as they were concerned. You're not taking that many houses away from the housing stock. And I think we've done a great service to the people of this city by allowing them to be able to buy their own house over very many years. I think that's all I want to say on housing, except I think we ought to bear in mind that in recent years, the Homes England and Community Agency, whatever name it's called now, are giving, and currently giving, millions of pounds in grants to housing providers, to our registered housing providers, to assist them in building social housing and various other categories of housing. So to actually seem to indicate that we're not actually getting any money or enough money, I think it's correct. We will never have enough money, we will always want more, but we are getting a considerable amount of assistance from the government, and I think we should recognise that. And just finally, on austerity, which you're very keen to keep pointing to every time you get to speak, City Mayor, you talk about austerity. What you seem to forget about is the words from the Labour minister when you lost power, where in fact they said the cupboard was bare, there was nobody left. The Labour government has spent it all, and we were left, in fact, with no money at all. That's why we've had the austerity measures, Mr Mayor, because the Labour government spent all the money and left nothing in the kitty to spend. Thank you.
Councillor Ferguson.
Thank you, Chair. I hope nobody thinks I'm being too partisan or political when I follow Councillor Robin Garrido. There's one point that I don't think has been taken up from the Mayor's speech, and that was in relation to the homeless count that he took part in, and I'd like to, first of all, congratulate him and the other councillors and members of the workforce who actually took part in that. But I just want to raise questions about how meaningful the numbers are that are achieved. There's an article in the Huffington Post published yesterday about these figures, and last year there were 33 local authorities that recorded a 0 figure when they did their overnight count. And the local authority leaders recognise that this is an unrealistic number. It doesn't represent the truth. The problem is that this is a government initiative, and I'm not trying to be party political when I say the government's initiative, but what it is that they consider that to get a figure of the homeless problem, they should just take a snapshot of the figures on one particular night. And that snapshot will depend not just on the number of people that are actually sleeping out, but the number of people that are actually out doing the count itself. But the problem that we have is that government takes these figures and they are what determines their policy for dealing with homelessness, purely on figures taken on one night. I looked at the Salford figures for 2017, where according to these figures, we were one in the top 10 for the number of increases of people on the street. But last year, there were 49 people found homeless sleeping on the street, rough sleepers. The year before, it was just 26. Now, I don't know how accurate those figures are, but we have outreach organisations and we have charities dealing with homeless people, and I'm quite sure that the figures that they're dealing with would give a much accurate figure of the problem that we have, and would help the government to give a more realistic basis for when they determine their policy. So whilst I appreciate what people have done, and I'd offer to come out next time you do this myself, but I think that we need more accurate figures to be dealing with this.
Thank you. Councillor Karen Guido.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you, City Mayor. I take great exception to you actually thinking that our group, right, would take acceptable the children who are living in poverty. We don't. We never have done, and we would do all we can. We're not the government, we're actually the local councillors, and we would do our best to actually make sure that no child should be in poverty. And I take great exception to being put into that category. I would never, ever, ever expect any child to put into any danger or into any unacceptable situation, whatever the age is. A child to me is a child, and we are all corporate parents, and we need to be caring about these. I'm glad to hear, because I'm really glad to hear that we've got some positive news from the City Mayor, because it's the same every month. And I just think that sometimes we need to change the record. I'm really sorry, City Mayor. I like you as a person, but I actually think that the record is getting a bit stuck. And I would like at some stage, I did mention it at the agenda setting, to hear about the money that's coming into Greater Manchester to Andy Burnham. I know you talk about the money that's coming for other things, but I would like to know how much Salford is receiving from this money. I don't expect you to have it now. On the scrutiny that I sit on, there seems to be millions coming into Greater Manchester, and I'm hoping, and I know that you and the officers will be doing their best to actually get some of this money. But I'd really like to know how much of that money. And the other thing is, perhaps if Andy Burnham comes to talk to the scrutiny committee that I sit on, maybe you'd like to come along and listen to him, because he is quite upbeat at times. He's not an unhappy person like you seem to be, and he was very positive on some things. I know it was a bit negative about some things that the government was doing, but he was very positive about the money that was coming into the Northern Powerhouse. And I think we have to stop at some stage running ourselves down. I accept that, we may not think that there is poverty in the Cotswolds. There could be poverty in the Cotswolds because they may not have any jobs because of the countryside that they're in. So I don't know that. And the other thing I'd like to say is, one thing you did miss out, right, was, and I found out last week, was that we've actually supplied dog pods for people who are homeless. And I think that that is an excellent idea. According to Andy Burnham, we're the only ones doing it. And I think that there are a lot of people on the streets who actually have dogs, and they don't want to go into any shelter because they can't take the dogs in. And I'd like to congratulate you, if you know anything about it, that there are lovely dog pods in the city. And finally, I've just had, because Robin can't come back, the monthly rent is £338. Social rent, yes. Which is, I think that's £78 a week, I think. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you. Councillor Saunders.
Group to defend the Conservative government. I'd just like to make 2 points. Unlike my colleague, I'm not going to discuss my feelings for the City Mayor or his disposition. I'm going to make just 2 points. Following on my colleague, Councillor Robin Garrido, I'd like to refer you to column 649 of Hansard of Monday's debate in the House of Commons, in which the new Works and Pensions Secretary was challenged with the words of the UN rapporteur. I had expected the City Mayor to mention this. And she says, I'll just be very brief, she says, tackling all poverty is a priority for the Department of Work and Pensions. We know the best way out of poverty is to make sure people get into work. But more than that, we know that a strong economy will deliver the higher paid jobs. And that is what this government are going to focus on. And we will listen and engage with non-governmental organisations and others to make sure we can deliver that. And secondly, I'd like to associate myself with much of what you said about the homelessness, and I think that a lot is being done, and I know you, City Mayor, are at the heart of a lot of it. But homelessness is a very complex situation. I had a very strange experience only last night when there was, I don't know if he was homeless, but he was certainly begging outside Tesco's, and I engaged him in conversation, which I usually do, and I said, you know, there is help you can get, and he absolutely stunned me, and he said, well, this is the will of God, and it's a test for me, and I'll get through it.
Councillor Brocklehurst.
Thank you, Chair. It's just a quick comment in support of the work that City Mayor Paul has been doing actively in supporting the health and security of homeless and rough sleepers. Because it's just a bit of an anecdotal point, really. But on Monday of this week, I was contacted in line of my work around water safety in the regional centre by colleagues from ROSPA, telling us that they'd noticed rough sleepers down at the Markaddy pub, either in or around the Markaddy, taking shelter in the winter period. And part of the initiative is that Paul has been out with the rough sleeping team, not just doing the count, but actively engaging with rough sleepers. Now, I contacted Paul's office on Monday, and I wish to thank him, not just for the officer's immediate response, but for his personal immediate involvement in response in ensuring the safety and security of people in that area. Now, we haven't got people rough sleep in that area now. They've moved away voluntarily from the Markaddy. There wasn't immediate risk of people falling in because the airwell's adequately fenced at that point, but the concern was, we know it's been an area of flooding in the past, so there's a risk that at night, whilst they were sleeping, there's a possibility, heaven forbid, that we have a deluge, the area was flooded, and their lives could have been at risk. So thank you for that immediate intervention. It just shows you that we've got a mayor that is hands-on, gets involved, and gets things done. So thank you for that.
Councillor Les Turner.
Does it matter?
No.
Thank you, Chair. I've got the wrong mic on. Can you hear them?
It can be me.
Can that be you?
Yeah.
Oh, great. Thank you. May I firstly associate myself with the remarks made by the City Mayor and Councillor Hines regarding the tragedy that's befallen Peter O'Connor's family. I've known him for a long time, ever since I've been on this council. Really nice person, and he's had an awful lot of problems recently, and our thoughts on this side are with him. The other thing, well, the Mayor said quite a lot, but I was always taught that when you come into the council chamber, it's the one place you can be political. And the Mayor certainly takes full advantage of that. Every 2 months, time and time again. And he rightly points out the positives that the City Council are taking, and I appreciate that, and I'm sure the residents do. He talks about housing, and we've all spoke about housing. Yes, we do need more housing, but we need the housing in the right place, and we need the right infrastructure. And there's some people up in that gallery who have had housing imposed on them. Their lives have probably been made a misery, I'm sure they have, and they would tell you if you asked them. So it is important with any housing to have it in the right place. Yeah. Not housing for housing's sake, to have the infrastructure that goes with it. That includes doctors and all the support. And it's not happening. It is not happening. And it's not right. We're making people's lives a misery. So yes, housing in the right place. I think Andy Burnham actually believes that as well. Yeah. I think he supports that. So that's why he withdrew the GMSF. So I think we have to bear that in mind. The other thing we have to bear in mind is the thought that a Labour government will be the answer to this country's problems. What planet are you on? What blinking planet are you on? It is not the answer. Now, my colleague here, Councillor Robin Greeder, didn't have the figures. Well, I've got the figures. Employment is up by 3.36 million since 2010. The employment rate is now at 75.5%. Unemployment is down by 1.13 million. Unemployment rate nearly halved. Youth employment nearly halved. 81% of jobs created are full-time. 1.6 million women more in work. 973,000 disabled have entered work since 2013 when records began. This means that since 2010 there will be 4.2 million new jobs created, making John McDonnell, and I'm sure the City Mayor knows John McDonnell, who doesn't, his prediction of 1.2 million jobs lost is out by 5.4 million. So I don't think Labour are the answer to our problems. In fact, no Labour government has ever left office with less unemployment than when they came in. Yeah. So don't tell us that Labour is the answer to our problems. It most certainly isn't. Thank you. Oh. I can't switch it off.
The last questioner is Councillor John Womasham.
Thank you, Chair. I wasn't going to speak, but listening to that absolute Tory nonsense, just unbelievable. You know, what the Mayor said is bang on. You know, it was interesting that when he raised the UN report on austerity, the Conservative group opposite all hung their heads, and so they should. What this Tory government has done to this country, let alone this city, is nothing more than disgraceful. You look at the effect on people that are living in poverty because of your policies, the effect on people because of bedroom tax, people that are sanctioned, people that are declared fit, that have got terminal cancer and other illnesses, is nothing short of a disgrace. And it was right that you hung your heads. You look at Councillor Robin Garrido talking about right to buys. Fine, right to buy, no problem. But where was the money to rebuild houses, to get people back into social housing? It wasn't there, it was taken away from us. It's absolutely disgrace, absolute disgrace. But I will, while I'm on my feet, pay tribute to those that do work with the homeless. I'm lucky that I'm a trustee on Loaves and Fishes, and the work that organisation does is second to none. Over this last year, we've seen a rise in 50% of people attending. Struggling financially, obviously, but still doing a sterling job. I'm also proud that, you know, Langworthy Ward, we seem to have everything. We've got the Narrowgate, we've got Emmaus, we've got the foyer, you know, and as the 3 ward councillors, you know, we're happy to support that and work with those people. And it's great that the community, particularly around Salford Precinct area, also support us. You know, that they're coming out with coats and etc. And it's, you know, it's really good. And I just finished it. I cannot believe that in the 21st century, a country as rich as ours is depending on food banks. It is an absolute disgrace. And as I said at the start, this Tory opposition in this city were right to hang their heads when that UN report was mentioned, because what it says is the truth. And your support, if you support your government, you should be ashamed of yourselves for what it's done to this city.
City Mayor Paul Dennis.
Okay, there's quite a lot to reply to there, but I'll do my best. First of all, Councillor Reynolds, thank you very much for your comments on carers and young carers in society. I think you're absolutely right. They are the unsung heroes of our city and our society in 21st century Britain. However, it's quite clear to me we need to do more to support them, ensure that they can exercise their rights, and also ensure that they're paid decently and can enable them to make ends meet. Councillor Lewis, thank you also for your kind words in terms of how, you know, the City Council, the emergency services have responded to the fire in Little Hulton. And it was great to hear, you know, you share your anecdotes about the neighbourhood centre and the fantastic work that officers have been doing there. It is really great to have that feedback from yourself. And I think you're absolutely right to point out that it is absolutely critical that the residents of Little Hulton were provided with those timely responses, given all the issues they've been facing over recent months and years. So thank you very much for that. And it's heartening to hear that officers have been doing a great job in that part of the city. Councillor Hines, thank you for your kind words and condolences for Peter, Mary and the family. And you're absolutely right. I don't think anything could be worse than facing what Peter and Mary are facing at the moment. And, you know, sometimes words fail us in those situations. We just feel so emotional. We can't actually put it into words how we actually feel. So I support your comments there. I think you're absolutely right to call out the failures of the economy. And, you know, the Chancellor's giveaway budget doesn't mean anything for this City Council because, I mean, we're still faced with making £16 million worth of cuts for the next financial year. That's on top of us already having taken out of our budget £198 million since 2010. And that has had a significant impact on jobs in this city, and it's also had a significant impact on the services we deliver, especially to some of the most vulnerable members within our communities and within the city of Salford. I do think the world is in a perilous state at the moment, Councillor Hines. I think you're absolutely right to call that out. And I am concerned about the rise of the right wing and fascism in parts of Europe and other parts of the world. And I think we need to watch carefully how that continues to develop over the next few months and years, because we must ensure that that has no place in society in Britain. Councillor Kelly, thank you also for highlighting the great work that the Manchester Evening News did recently in terms of their article on housing and rough sleeping more specifically in the city of Salford. I think you're absolutely right to highlight that housing and a roof over someone's head is an absolute basic need. Maslow's hierarchy of needs talks about shelter very much at the base on which you start to build a life. But it seems we've forgotten this in 21st century Britain. And I think you're also right to point out the relationship between, you know, most rough sleepers we came across are single males. And we know, certainly from the horrific statistics that have been shared with us recently in the city of Salford, that it's often single males that tragically take their own lives. So more needs to be done, clearly, to support those individuals. I have to say it's very difficult when you're being forced to make cuts year on year, and actually we desperately need that money to provide services and to support to some of the most vulnerable people in society. I think the Narrowgate, as you rightly point out, and Lowe's and Fishers, and as Councillor Warmisham's already highlighted, and Mayus and the Foyer and other service providers are doing a fantastic job in the city of Salford, and I'd like to pay real credit and tribute really to the work that they do all year round. You're right also to highlight the absolute need of a truly affordable housing, and I'll probably come on to that more when I respond to Councillor Garrido's point, because housing has become a complex issue, just like homelessness is a complex issue. And I think to deal with the problem, we need to deal with the system and the complexity that is clearly giving rise to the situation you talk about in terms of our inability to provide truly affordable housing, whilst at the same time, year on year, we're actually losing truly affordable housing from our system for a whole host of different reasons. Councillor Paul Wilson, thanks for your question about the 13,000 figure. And just to confirm, that's the figure for Greater Manchester since 2012. The reason why it's 13 is it's about social rent. So we've lost 13,000 social rented properties within Greater Manchester since 2012. The reasons are many. Right to buy has a bearing on that number. Demolitions and regeneration, that potentially leads to a net loss of social rented properties, which sometimes does happen. Conversions from social rents to affordable rents. Affordable rents are often not affordable, despite the language, because they have no real relationship with what people earn. They only have a real relationship with the market, and we know housing markets are just continuing to rise. And the other reason why we're losing social rents is because we've noticed recently some people are selling social rented properties on the open market, and I'm talking about housing associations doing that, if you've seen the Manchester Evening News recently. And I understand, speaking from officers at the Combined Authority, that this is something that has been historically encouraged by the regulator. It's how we deal with, if you like, properties that are costing us slightly more money, is to consider selling them on the open market. In my opinion, that clearly needs to stop when we've got 85,000 people on our housing waiting lists within Greater Manchester. The questions you raise around the housing revenue account, the future of our relationship with people like City West and Salix Homes, I think we have to wait till December until we get the local government settlement to better understand what that actually means for the city of Salford. Yes, there's been a big announcement, obviously, in the Chancellor's statement about lifting the cap on the housing revenue account, but what does that actually mean for this city? So happy to share with you the details when more information becomes available. In terms of the business plan for Derive, I'm sure Councillor Kelly and Councillor Merry would be delighted to sit down with you and talk through the business plan. I don't know if you've contacted them yet, but by all means do so. At the moment, we're on with building 72 properties within the city of Salford through Derive that will be truly affordable. Councillor Garrido, thank you for agreeing with my comments on carers and young carers within society. That is much appreciated. However, when it comes to housing, I think you probably missed the point I was trying to make, really. And that is, you know, we've lost over 92,000 properties under right to buy in Greater Manchester since 1980, since the legislation for right to buy was put in place. The issue we've got is as we lose them, which, you know, as Councillor Warmisham highlighted, fantastic if people are moving into home ownership. Those homes aren't being replaced, though. That's the issue. And we know nationally that 40% of homes on average bought under right to buy don't become a home for someone. They move into the private rented sector. The person who purchases those properties becomes a landlord, in a sense, and makes money from that asset. So on average, that works out at 40% a year. On top of that, we've got lots of other complex issues, because I know from your comments, you didn't really deal with the complexity of the situation. Quite often, Homes England will only release grant to housing associations, and I know you're heavily involved with a housing association, to build for affordable rent. Affordable rent has no relationship with what people earn, and quite often pushes people into poverty. And you know, We've recently bid to Homes England to try and get access to some of the money that's available for social rented properties. But I'm not optimistic because of what I said earlier about the methodological approach the government used through people like Homes England to actually allocate grant funding or infrastructure funding. That is disproportionately going into the London and the South East. I have a map to prove it. The government talked in their autumn budget about geographical targeting. They said where the gap between the price of housing and average wages is the biggest, that's where we'll be spending most public capital. And that just so happens to be London and the southeast of the country. So when you talk about infrastructure and housing and affordable housing, we know we need access to public sector grant or subsidy, whatever you want to call it. But unfortunately, we've got a government, it's your government, it's the Conservative government, that is more than happy to push billions of pounds worth of public capital into London and the southeast. It is a disgrace. It's an absolute disgrace. And when you say it's not true, I'm more than happy to provide you with the details because we've done a lot of work on this. We've done a lot of work on Right to Buy, and we've done a lot of work on all the various funding streams that Homes England are administering. And I'm hoping to take a report to the next combined authority. You might want to have a read of that. We've already done a paper on Right to Buy. That's already available in the public domain, because I did note that you actually said you didn't have access to the figures, but the figures are there. They're publicly available for you to see what I'm talking about. I'm not making this up. I'm dealing with facts and evidence. So I don't agree with you on housing, and I think you do need to deal with the complexity. And to date, local authorities have been prevented from building council housing. Housing associations, you'll know, have been forced to make a 1% cut on rents year on year. That's had a catastrophic impact on their ability to build social rented properties. Why? Because they've not got the revenue income coming in to enable them to do that, or to enable them against which to borrow money to enable them to do that. So let's deal with the facts, and I'm more than happy to sit down with you and go through the facts and explain all this to you. But it's a complex situation, and unfortunately we've got a government that doesn't actually believe in council housing. They believe that the private market will deliver the housing that we need as a nation. They won't. We know that they won't. What they will do is they'll build housing that is totally unaffordable for people, and that's fundamentally the issue. And that's also propped up by your government's National Planning Policy Framework. So let's deal with the facts. Councillor Ferguson, thank you very much for the comments you made about the meaningfulness or lack of meaningfulness, really, in terms of how we measure homelessness and rough sleeping in the city of Salford. I did say in my speech, on the night of the account, we knew between Andy Burnham's Bed Every Night initiative and our own work as a city council, we were accommodating 62 people that potentially would have been sleeping on our streets that night. And then in addition to that, the group I was with, we came across 12 people sleeping rough on our streets. From last year, we started to provide estimates back in terms of the statistical returns back to government. So that's why you come across the figure of 49. That doesn't mean we actually found 49 people on the streets that night when we did the last statistical return. It's just an estimate figure, and that looks at people who are in night shelters, and it looks at people we've placed elsewhere who would have been sleeping rough on the night. So that's why I couldn't verify the precise figure, because until we've done all of that work, I won't know. What I can say, though, is in terms of the people we found on the streets of Salford that night, that number had increased from the previous year in 2017. And you're absolutely right. This is fraught with problems, the approach. It comes down to where you go to on the night, the number of people who decide to come out with us, how big your teams are, and people move around all the time, don't they? So, being able to actually find people actually sleeping rough. It's really difficult. And what I will say is we're now committed as a local authority, because we did get access to some additional funding, to doing this every 2 months. So the City Council will be out on the streets every 2 months looking at the numbers of people who are sleeping. So we do need to get better at that. But I guess for me, What we need to be spending more of our time on is thinking about why this is happening in the first place. And as far as I'm concerned, it's because the system is failing these people, the system is becoming more precarious, and that's because we have a Conservative government that believes in austerity. Councillor Gredo, thank you for your comments with regards to children in poverty. Although it wasn't aimed at yourselves, I think you took it as that, because I certainly wasn't directly referencing you as a group. However, what I was doing was referencing the political party you're members of, who obviously are in government. So indirectly, I guess you could say I was making reference to you. But like yourself, we are all corporate parents, and I take the issue of child poverty really seriously in this city, as does Councillor Merry and Councillor Walsh and the mayoral team more generally. And we do need to do more to ensure children do not live in poverty in the 21st century. And it is a shocking indictment that we have the numbers we have living in poverty. And as I tried to highlight through the work on young people not in education, employment or training, and those not claiming benefits, unless we invest in our young people, all we are doing is storing up huge problems for the future. You know, these are the people who are going to be running this country in the future. If we can't invest in them now, what can we do as a civilised society? Okay. You also referenced Andy Burnham being slightly more upbeat. So I thought I'd quickly just read to you his comments on the issue of capital funding going into London and the South East.
Sorry, can I just clarify what I said?
Well, you said he was more upbeat and he was less grumpy than I am, so I'm just illustrating to you that...
As our scrutiny meeting.
Absolutely, but you were making a general statement about him being different to me. No, I think if you get access to the record, I think we'll have a debate about that, but I think you'll find I'm right. Anyway, Andy Burnham, Greater Manchester Mayor, said, "I am still trying to give the government the benefit of the doubt on its promises of a northern powerhouse, but this makes it very difficult. It is simply indefensible to shovel billions of pounds of public money into the more affluent areas where all parts of England are facing a housing crisis. The fact that only 3 areas of the north of the M62 will receive any benefit at all says everything. Such a skewed distribution of public money is demonstrably unfair and unacceptable. It overlooks the huge economic potential of the north of England and the Midlands, as well as several southern English cities and coastal towns, and will fuel the economy where it's already the strongest. Right now, the government should be working hard to bring our country back together rather than widening its economic and social divides. We need policies that will rebalance our economy and that are fair to people everywhere. That's why this policy cannot go unchallenged, and I call on the government to think again." I think you'll probably find he's in agreement with what I've said today in council. Okay, Councillor Saunders, you drew attention to the Secretary of State's comment about tackling all poverty is a priority for her and how work is critical. What we're actually seeing is work in and of itself isn't actually an antidote to poverty. With the rise of 0-hour contracts, poor pay, you know, we're talking less than living wage here, by the way. Also, you know, people who want full-time hours and are only able to access part-time employment. So I think we really need to look at what we mean by work, because, You know, institutionalised in-work poverty is becoming a reality in 21st century Britain. New glass ceilings are emerging now where people can't earn over a certain amount of money. And Cambridge University have done some really interesting labour market research on this, where people are being pushed down and also people are rising at the top. So we've got people earning huge wages and people reaching a glass ceiling within the labour market, not able to get over something around £21,000, I think, is the glass ceiling. And as a consequence of rising inflation and cost of living, inevitably it pushes more and more people into poverty. So work in and of itself isn't an antidote. So I think we need to look hard at that, actually. You're absolutely right to say a strong economy and higher paid jobs is part of the solution. And I think that's what the government's acknowledged, is we need an industrial strategy for this country, which is why they're working with Greater Manchester to try and realise that. It's also indicating to me that at the moment we don't actually have an industrial strategy, and actually we have an imbalanced economy which benefits London and the South East, and everyone else of us are suffering as a consequence of that. So I think you'll find there's spatial differences up and down the country in terms of this strong economy. Homelessness is complex, and I agree with you, absolutely. And we need to deal with the complexity in the system to actually tackle some of this. Councillor Brocklehurst, thanks for your comments and kind words, really, in terms of how we're approaching rough sleeping and homelessness in the city. We'll continue to do all we can, and we'll work with all members of this chamber if you have any issues and concerns expediently to solve those. And thanks for raising the issue around water safety. The Mark Addy has always been on the radar of the City Council in terms of where we visit when we do the rough sleep accounts, because we do know homeless people have chosen to sleep in that part of the city sometimes. Councillor Turner, thanks again for your comments and condolences for Councillor Connor and Mary, and you know, I share that. Like yourself, I'm absolutely committed to building the right homes in the right places. But as we've illustrated, I think, in today's council, when you've got a government that is stuffing money into London and the South East for housing and infrastructure and affordable housing, I don't think that's an easy task. We've also got a government that protects developer profits over building truly affordable housing. And that's propped up by your own government's national planning policy framework. So in some respects, yes, we have an aspiration to build the right homes in the right places, but I guess my challenge to you, Councillor Turner, and your party and the government is we really need to look at those policies that hamper and constrain our ability as a local authority to be able to do that. I'll move, I won't really comment too much on the comments you make about how good the economy is doing. I don't see very much evidence of that, but thanks for citing all the statistics. You've heard about people who don't form part of the official statistics today in the report I've given in terms of some of our young people. You've also got a government that's committed to an arbitrary figure for housing of 300,000 homes per year by mid-2020s. So, you know, quite how your government has arrived at that number, I'm still not clear. I have written a letter to the Minister on this issue, but not had a response to that yet. But yeah, you're committed to a numbers game. It seems numbers are all that matter. I'm more interested in lived experiences and delivering proper progressive social change. Councillor Warmisham, thank you so much for coming back to some of the comments that have been made by the opposition. I think you're absolutely right. It is that Tory nonsense, basically. The UN rapporteur's report into poverty and austerity speaks for itself. It's just interesting that we've got a government that's in total denial and wants to almost like forget this has actually happened, which is an absolute disgrace. And like the rapporteur said, you know, what we need is the ministers and the secretaries of state to actually come out into our communities and neighbourhoods to actually see for themselves what's happening, rather than hiding in their ivory towers in the halls of Whitehall and Westminster. You know, it's quite clear to me we've got a government that has no real relationship with reality and the lived experiences that people are facing in our communities and in our neighbourhoods. You're absolutely right to say thanks to Loaves and Fishes. They do fantastic work in the city, along with the Emmaus, the Foyer and the Narrowgate, and many other community and voluntary sector providers in the city, so thanks for that. And you're right to say that, you know, in 21st century Britain, You know, is it really civilised that we've got people relying on food banks to enable them to make ends meet? It's absolutely not, and I fully endorse your comments, Councillor Warmisham, so thank you. Hopefully that answers everyone's questions. Thanks.
Thank you. We'll now have a 10-minute interval. Item 11, general questions or comments to Cabinet members on the discharge of responsibilities within their portfolios. Councillor Bushell, Statutory Deputy City Mayor. Yes, please.
Last week, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights released the statement of the findings of the Special Rapporteur, Professor Alston's visit to the UK. He found that in the UK, 14 million people are living in poverty, with 1.5 million destitute and unable to afford basic essentials. Whilst local authorities, which perform vital roles in providing a real social safety net, have been gutted by a series of government policies, and respected charities and think tanks have all drawn attention to the dramatic decline in the fortunes of the least well-off, the government has remained in a determined state of denial. Professor Alston suggests that the DWP is more concerned with making economic savings and sending messages about lifestyles than responding to the multiple needs of those living with disability, job losses, housing insecurity, and the demands of parenting. He further reports on cruel, inhuman and degrading sanction regimes, resulting in the systematic violation of the rights of people with disabilities, and that the implementation of universal credit is negatively impacting on mental health, finances and work prospects. He reports countless stories of hardships suffered under universal credit, but when questioned, government ministers were entirely dismissive. In his conclusion, Professor Alston states, austerity could have been spared the poor had the political will existed, but the political choice was made to fund tax cuts for the wealthy instead. In Salford, a decision has been taken to speed up the rollout of universal credit from full service to live service for all existing claimants, giving them just 4 weeks to submit their claims. This is causing extreme hardship for our residents. I had one client last week who, due to an error, didn't receive any payments at all towards her rent. As a new tenant, this has immediately put her at risk of homelessness. Previously, there was a limit applied to deductions from payments, but with universal credits, payments are being massively reduced to cover emergency payments and other debts, leaving people unable to meet even their basic needs. In some cases, people are having their benefits halved. This week, I had a young woman with a 6-week-old baby attend for advice. Her universal credit had been reduced to 0, as she was deemed to have received 2 lots of SMP in the same period, due to the fact that she gets paid 4 weekly and not calendar monthly.
Councillor Bushell, what more can be done to protect our residents from such horrific situations?
Councillor Bushell.
Thank you, Councillor Bentham. Clearly heartfelt comments. We have talked a little bit, or the City Mayor has talked a bit today about this report, but I think it's really important to understand it and not try and sweep it under the carpet, as the government seem intent on doing. Professor Philip Aston is an independent expert appointed by the UN to conduct research, analysis and to visit countries where human rights infringements and people living in extreme poverty is alleged. He took 12 days specifically investigating the impact of the government austerity measures in the UK. As I understand it, the UN and most other organisations, including most EU middle-income countries, measure poverty relatively. This means people living with less than 55% of the median income, and it takes account of costs such as childcare, housing, debt and disability. The UK government measure by absolute poverty. This is 60% of the median income and does not take living costs into account. This is why you may hear Tory ministers saying poverty has reduced. It clearly has not. And now the Human Rights Council confirms what we are seeing on a daily basis and what we've been campaigning about for some time. Real poverty, food banks, homelessness, sofa surfing, sanitary poverty, fuel poverty, teachers providing food and clothing to pupils, communities organising winter coat donations. The list could go on. Councillor Bentham and other frontline workers could give many case studies of real misery, and we've just heard 2 of them, and hardship caused by welfare reforms. This report only confirms what we and they already knew. Their frustration is that no one in the government is listening. They are in denial, which incidentally this report accuses them of. You mentioned the 14 million people living in poverty and 1.5 in destitution. The City Mayor also made comments. Here are some other shocking statements from this report. Government policies have inflicted great unnecessary misery, especially on working poor, on single mothers, on people with disabilities and millions of children locked into a cycle of poverty from which many will have great difficulty escaping. The UK government policies and drastic cuts to social support are entrenching high levels of poverty and homelessness. He then makes a statement. Punitive, mean-spirited and often callous austerity was hitting women and children the hardest. He said if you've got a group of misogynists and put them in a room and said how can we make this system work for men and not for women, they could not have come up with too many different ideas to this government. What a shameful indictment on the UK. As Councillor Hines said, the 5th richest economy in the world. You ask what more we can do to protect our residents. Last year, along with many other councils and organisations, we campaigned to fix universal credit. I also put forward a motion to this council to halt and fix universal credit, and it was supported by the opposition in Salford. But despite minor tweaks, we know it continues to fail. We read this every day in the press, leaving families in debt and 3 million children in working households in poverty. It has to stop. Will the opposition support us now, asking for universal credit to stop? We have to end the misery that it's causing. Labour in power has said it will stop the rollout of universal credit, end the benefit freeze and transform social security so that it truly supports those most in need. In Salford, we continue to implement our anti-poverty strategy. It remains a priority, as you know, of the City Mayor. We are the 22nd most deprived in England and the 3rd in GM. We have 3 main aims in our strategy. Supporting people in poverty now, preventing people falling into poverty and influencing government to get a fairer deal for Salford people. I've reported before that we've looked carefully at how we can poverty-proof our own policies and services, including investing in Salford's credit union, investing in the Salford's crisis food support service, abolishing burial and cremation fees for children under 16, reducing the cost of funerals in Salford, exempting young care leavers from paying council tax, and other initiatives. I will be presenting my annual report to Council on the anti-poverty strategy in the March Policy Forum. I can only hope, with the government in complete disarray, a general election is called, because only a Labour government can build a just and compassionate society that we need.
Councillor John Merry, Deputy City Mayor, including questions to regards children's services in the absence of Councillor Stone. Yes. Councillor Collington.
Thank you, Chair. I wish I hadn't done this, but I did. I got involved in an online rant on Salford Online, and I have to say these were not our supporters, so I'll leave that one open. It was to do with a freedom of information question that was asked with regards to how much money had been collected in school fines in 2017-2018 and what happened to the money. And it turns out apparently it was almost £119,000 that was collected in school fines. I therefore asked the Assistant Director what happened to the money and was told it was fed back into Education Welfare Service. So I dutifully put this online and it all kind of backfired somewhat because they don't believe it. They said maybe a small amount of it is put into education welfare, but what happens to the rest of the money? So that's my question. I don't know whether that can be answered today or whether I can get a response later on. Thank you.
Grateful, and yes, I appreciate you defending the honour of the City Council online. The situation is that the money is applied to the Education and Welfare Service, actually, and there was an issue raised with an FOI request where the answer that was given was okay insofar as it went, but it didn't contain the detail that you've been given, I think, from an officer. Basically, the answer that they were given was that the money goes towards the General Council funds. Well, from that General Council funds, it then goes to the EWO service. Perhaps in answering this question, the first point I would say, and this is a point which is common to your government and us, we agree on this actually, is it's not a good thing for children to be taken out of school during term time. And I appreciate that this is a thing that used to happen in the past quite frequently. In fact, to be honest, my parents took me out of school at various points for holidays, but that was before the fine system and before you ask. When I mention my parents, it's obviously a long time ago, right? So the situation has changed. It's not acceptable these days to take children out, and there is a system of fixed penalties and fines. They felt, the people as I understand it, that money should immediately go back to the school.
Well, I don't think that's a particularly sensible way of actually dealing with it, actually, because it would be seen, you know, as an extra contribution towards the schools, and parents might be prepared to say, oh, well, I'm making an extra contribution to the school by taking my children out. What we do try to do is to apply it to a service that is universally accepted across all of our schools as providing a really good service in terms of the general welfare of the children, in terms of chasing up on cases, right? Because don't forget that in some of these cases we're talking about children that might be potentially truanting and so forth, that the welfare officers have a duty to actually follow up. So I'm happy to discuss it further with you, but I think, you know, I think that is the most sensible response we can make under the circumstances.
Councillor Paul Wilson.
Thank you, Chair. During the interval, Councillor Mary and myself were discussing the Trident Safety Report relating to tower block safety at Pendleton together. Clearly, the residents in the tower blocks are extremely concerned, and in the September meeting of the Growth and Prosperity Scrutiny, we did discuss this, and it was resolved that Ben Dolan and yourself were going to discuss it with the City Mayor. I understand since that part of the report is potentially would damage the litigation case that may arise, and I understand that you wouldn't want to share that full report, which isn't the council's report, with the wider public. However, I think the residents do want to know the conclusions of that report, and there is certainly a lot of confusion out there. So if Councillor Merry could answer how we are going to get that report conclusions to the residents of those tower blocks. My second question is relating to free schools. As a lifelong socialist, I'm politically opposed to free schools, and I'm surprised the Tory group haven't stood up and attacked us today for signing off on free schools against the Labour manifesto. What I would like to know is how Councillor Merry is going to ensure that we don't have free schools that waste money. Thank you.
Please.
One at a time then, yep. Well, first of all, I think we've already explained on several occasions there isn't a single report, and it's not our report, right? It is a report that it is a series of surveys that Pete Holt compiled in terms of the state of the various blocks. And you're quite right, some of that will be used, I am sure, potentially in future litigation. And I don't think it would be sensible, I don't think anybody in this council chamber would agree that it would be sensible for them to release details until they have to of information that is going to be required to continue in terms of litigation. What they have offered to do, and I think that's been communicated adequately in the press and elsewhere, is to share the conclusions of that report with individuals who want to contact them. And I think that's a perfectly fair response. And that has followed representations made by both myself and Ben Dolan following the committee. It is not a magic bullet that is going to tell people things, I don't think, that is not already obvious to the residents that there have been issues, right? It's not going to identify any particular new issues as far as I'm concerned. It is going to identify issues around what needs to be done to tackle it. And I think those conclusions should be shared with them, but I don't think we could recommend sharing the full report to them. You ask about free schools, right? Can we make it clear that it is not the policy of this city council, right, to support automatically free schools coming into Salford, right? I was a bit disappointed with the report in Salford Star, and Stephen Kingston, sometimes we have a bit of a banter, shall we say, but the report simply mentioned the fact that we were going to work with free schools, right, without explaining why that we have to work with free schools, unfortunately. The situation is that we, as as an authority, are expanding rapidly. And just as an aside, Councillor Garrido warned me many years ago that the people were leaving Salford in their droves and we better do something about the policies. Well, I think our policies have been justified, actually, the number of people wanting to come and live in the Socialist Republic of Salford, despite the Conservatives' best efforts. And I think they have chosen to do so because they know the opportunities that we have created for them. So as a result of that, we need lots and lots of new school places. Now, our first preference is to expand existing schools, and that will continue to be our first preference. But if we are going to establish new schools, then the government has made it clear that those new schools will either have to be an academy or a free school. Now, I'd ask you, Councillor Wilson, what am I supposed to do under those circumstances? Because I've expanded schools in your area, as you know, where it was possible to do so. What am I supposed to do in those circumstances? Do I say, no, we're going to allow children to live in inadequate and overcrowded schools? Or do I seek to work with a selected number of people, right, who are prepared to work with Salford? And what I did, and what has been recommended through the Cabinet, I think, to go forward, is we're establishing a series of principles. A series of principles that if free and academies want to sign up with Salford, right, will make it into a fundamentally different relationship. It's about involving them in the family of schools, about having regular discussions with the local authority, working with them to maintain school standards, allowing us the opportunity to intervene when things go wrong, all of that. And I'm happy to share those principles with you as to the framework that we're going to establish. But the problem is that if I say no free schools, no academies, the government is perfectly able, a government which unfortunately these people support, the government is perfectly able to say, well, you're having them anyway, right? So what do I do, right? I know that a Labour government has promised, and the promise which I fully support, to bring those schools back into a relationship with the public sector. I fully support that. I hope that happens as soon as possible. I've not changed my principles, but the fact remains that I have to ensure that children have decent schools to go to. And the best way of ensuring that, if we are going to have new schools, is to work with a certain number of providers to ensure that they stick to the principles that this City Council has endorsed. I would have thought that's something that you'd want to endorse as well.
Thank you. Councillor Rowan Guido.
Yeah. Okay, hopefully you heard the first bit of that. But the issue is that there was an article, I think it was in The Guardian this week, that referred to the cost of heating in the Pendleton Together high-rises because of the insulation that's been removed. And the other thing which also concerned me, in fact, was that it referred to 2021 as being the time when the work would be completed. Now, I'm sure that can't be correct because, you know, as you and I both know, work has been completed on other tower blocks, you know, in a very much shorter period. So can you give some assurance that it will not be 2021, and that must have been a mistake in The Guardian? And also, can you say what you're actually doing to cushion the effects of increased heating costs on the tenants of those high-rises?
Yes, I can first of all, let's deal with that one very simply. We are discussing appropriate compensation for those people. We have further discussions taking place with PTOL and with the relevant officers as to how we take that forward. So that is something that is ongoing. I appreciate that people are suffering as a result of the insulation not being adequate at this moment in time, and I want to take steps to actually ensure that we meet those particular concerns. Just on the other issue, I mean, perhaps I ought to start by gently reminding Councillor Robin Garrido, because Councillor Karen Garrido says she quite likes the City Mayor. I quite like Councillor Garrido, actually, Robin Garrido, even though we had spats across the chamber, right? But the fact remains, if I could just gently remind you, going back to the special meeting where I thought the Tory group behaved in the same decent manner that we did, we offered to lend the money to Peatol to start the work and to continue the work. Then we had the entire summer where the government's treasury, the ministerial department tied us up in knots and said, oh, well, we don't know, we're not sure, it might offend the rules of the EU, you might not be allowed to do this. We spent the entire summer arguing about this before they finally decided, no, you mustn't lend the money, right? If they're going to do it, they'll have to raise the money themselves, or you could always make them bankrupt and get them to withdraw, and then we might lend you the money under those circumstances. And that's why, you know, as a public sector organisation, we had to do the best we possibly could for those residents. We were very pleased that they've been able to raise the money in terms of the private sector, but the private sector funders have appointed ARUP to ensure that we get the best possible solution. And I'm certain that Councillor Robin Garrido, who I like, as I say, right, would not want me to come back in 3 or 4 years' time and say, we put the wrong system on and we're going to have to remove it and we're going to have to change it. So ARUP and Peatol are discussing the best way forward in terms of that. I'm hoping to be able to make an announcement on that very soon as to the way forward. I do not want it to continue to 2021. I've made that very clear. We want to speed up the process rather than slow it down, basically. And I'm working with Mr. Dolan and his officers to ensure that once we have got the system correct, that we roll it forward as quickly as possible. I'm sorry, at this moment in time, we're still engaged in discussions with Peatol, which would have been a lot quicker had we not been in a position of having to wait for the money to actually arrive.
Thank you. Councillor Paul Wilson.
Thanks, Chair. The reason I asked to come back in is that Councillor Mary asked me a question within his answer. I personally would work with faith schools to ensure that we have good quality education and look to provide extra places. I'd also look to use some of those mothball sites that we have, such as St Luke's, where we can actually have split sites, which would actually help support extra places within a local authority place setting. So that's how I would personally do it. Thank you.
Then what I take that as is a speech in support of our policy, actually, because as I announced the policy just then, I said that wherever possible, we will expand existing schools to do so. But there are a number of cases where we have not got the capacity in a particular area to expand it. So thank you, Councillor Wilson, for your support on that, because that is exactly what the policy we are proposing is. Wherever possible, expand schools, but if we are going to be put to a situation, not by us, but by the government and by the need for surplus places, for extra places, we will actually want to work with providers who are preferred to work with us. Thanks for that.
Councillor Gina Reynolds, Lead Member of Adult Services.
Thank you, Chair. I accept that census data is flawed as a method of identifying unpaid carers. However, the 2011 census showed that Walton South has the highest percentage of unpaid family carers in Salford. To give some context to my question, I'm going to read 2 short stories from Salford's unpaid carers about the realities of their situation. Thanks to the team from the Gaddam Centre for working to support unpaid carers and for providing these stories. The first is from a young carer. I am 11 years old and I have been supported by the Salford Carers Service for the last 2 years. I'm very proud of being a carer, but at the same time it's sometimes frustrating and it can be a real struggle. I live with my mum and my little brother. My mum has a physical illness that causes her excruciating pain. It makes it difficult for her to move and walk. My mum also struggles with depression. Sometimes she'll drink too much when things get bad. My biggest wish is my mum's condition to go away. I worry about her a lot. My little brother can be very fiery, and because my mum is unwell, she struggles to cope, and he misbehaves a lot and breaks everything. I feel bad for saying it, but my mum can't do the stuff that other mums do, like get up in the mornings. We get up late a lot. I get myself up, then I have to wake my mum up, and then get my brother up. Sometimes the electric's gone, and that makes us wait even later for school. When we go into school late, everyone stares at me, and then I struggle to catch up with my work. I worry about my mum when I'm in school. I think about whether she can move or not. The second story is from an adult carer. We were a happy, hard-working family, enjoying holidays and quality time with each other. Then in 2014, our world turned upside down as my partner had a massive heart attack while at work and he was rushed to hospital. My partner went back to work and we thought things were going back to normal, but then in 2015, he had another massive heart attack. My partner had to finish work. This became very hard, and I tried to work as many hours as I could to care for my partner, look after bills, and my granddaughters and my daughters. In 2016, he was then diagnosed with grade 3 aggressive cancer. He went on to have his bladder removed. My work were very unsupportive, and this made it hard for me. We had no support from our families. I finished work to look after my partner, so from a family working, we were left having to claim benefits. My partner struggled to adapt, and he also had a condition where he was in constant pain. He went into severe depression and suffered from PTSD as a result. I'm now his full-time carer, and my daughter is a young carer. My life has completely changed, from a working, happy person, socialising with people, to a person stuck in the house, not having anybody to talk to or turn to be shouted and screamed at constantly by my partner because he's in pain and he's suffering depression. I support my daughter as she's bullied at school because she's a young carer, and she herself is now suffering from depression and anxiety. My whole day is taken up by caring. It's so hard to never have any time for myself. I just sit and cry sometimes because it gets too much. Me and my daughter are both supported by Salford Carers. It's not a job I choose, but it's an unpaid, hard job caring for someone that needs that extra care. I can never plan anything as it just gets swept away. I and my partner's linked to the outside world, but if I can't go out because he doesn't want me to leave him, my world's just the same as his. My day is helping getting him out of bed, helping get him dressed, give him his breakfast and tablets, generally care for him, support him and listen to him if he's depressed or being shouted at because he's frustrated. It's really hard. These two carers are not alone. I agree with the Mayor that carers are the backbone of our city, carers of all ages. Caring for a loved one is challenging in itself, but it also brings with it a range of challenges as described in these two stories. Carers allowance is a pitiful £64.60 a week, despite the challenging nature of caring and the significant amount of money that carers save us in the care that they provide. The allowance is classed as an income replacement benefit, which means that young carers under 16, those who earn over a certain amount and those who receive state pension aren't eligible at all, despite the care that they provide. I've no doubt our social care and NHS services would collapse if unpaid carers didn't provide this care. I urge all members in this chamber to think about the impact of carers in every single decision they make, and I ask Councillor Reynolds, will Salford Council ensure it supports our unpaid carers?
Right, thank you very much for that, Laura. I mean, some horrendous stories there, highlighting real, genuine issues and difficulties facing carers and the families. And as you rightly say, I think with every single decision we make in the council, particularly regarding services, we've got to be mindful of carers as well as those families, and be thinking about them and their needs. There is this 26,000 carers that we know of in this city, and we estimate there's about 6,500 carers out there in the city that are unknown to us. And there's nearly 3,000 young carers as well on top of that. So we need to ensure, as I say, that we're meeting their need. Currently, we as I say, the Gadham Centre have come to us today, give tremendous support to carers and the families. They're giving peer support, education, training, and trying to get carers into employment. And they're doing this right across all ages, so they're also looking after young carers and supporting them. And there's also 29 voluntary support groups out there across the city that are providing support to carers as well. Currently, there's an 18-month pilot scheme at Salford Royal. It is, I have to say, only on the older people's wards and in Meadowbrook. And that's where we've got support workers in there that are identifying carers as they come into hospital. And then they're offering them, once they leave, 6 weeks of intensive support and training. And I'm hoping that will continue, that pilot will become something that's embedded in Salford Royal and it'll be rolled out right across the hospital. We've done a lot of recent publications over the last year, the Carers Charter and the Young Carers and Young Adult Carers Manifesto, and this really has highlighted need. There's been a lot of engagement with carers, staff from carers organisations and services to try and inform that. And on the back of that, there's a GM carers strategy that's being written, which is almost about to be finalised. And we have been writing our own Salford carers strategy that is aligned to the GM strategy. And as I say, that has been really informed and shaped by carers across the city. They've had a tremendous amount of input into those strategies. And in that, we're saying that we expect that carers are identified as early as possible, that they're informed, respected and included by health and social care services and professionals. We want carers to have choice and control of their lives. We want them to have the support that they need and the support for the families also, which I'd said earlier. And we want families and carers to be able to stay healthy, and we want them, as I say, to be recognised and supported. We also want them to be socially connected, to have a life outside caring and not to be isolated, because many carers are incredibly isolated. And we want everybody to be able to fulfil their aspirations in education and employment, because as we know, carers are often have low educational attainment. So we want to make sure that they can reach their potential the same as everybody else in the city. And last but not least, we need to be lobbying government and putting pressure on them for more funding, because as you say, it's pitiful what carers are paid. And we need to be trying to address this by putting more pressure on the government.
Councillor Paul Wilson.
Thanks, Chair. Just want to follow on from Laura in terms of carers. They do a fantastic job in the city, and they do certain supports where they have shortcomings, and I think certainly would have more shortcomings in have carers. I was contacted in April of this year by a carer called Jenny, and she contacted about a young man in his 30s that she was caring for, of which Councillor Reynolds does know. Unfortunately, Andrew, the young man she was caring for, who was 32, was living in conditions which could only be described as Dickensian. There was holes in the floors, there was holes in the windows, there was no hot water, there was no central heating, and as a result, this young man, unfortunately, became in a very ill condition. He was having regular injections to help with his medical issues. Unfortunately, those injection sites became infected. Because he was acutely aware that he was dirty and he smelt, he was embarrassed to go for his medical appointments, and he was struggling to get on the housing list. At this point, Jenny contacted me. Within a week, I've got to say the support from Councillor Kelly, getting him on the housing list was fantastic. Within a week, we got him accommodation. Jenny went round to see Andrew on that day. The accommodation was granted, and unfortunately, she found Andrew had passed away that day.
We have a lot of shortcomings within our social services. I believe that there's a case review that's currently ongoing, and I don't know who's chairing that independent case review for Andrew, but we need to learn those lessons. But we also need to make sure that people like Jenny get the support they need, both during that caring, but also afterwards as well. So I appreciate any support which can be offered, and if perhaps Councillor Reynolds and I could, after the meeting, could catch up to find out who's chairing that independent review and when those review findings will take place. Thank you.
Thank you. I must remind members we'll be finishing at 12:30 unless there's a resolution moved. Councillor John Ferguson. Councillor Paul Wilson.
Thank you, Chair. I'll ask another question. So, Councillor Ferguson, as you know, as somebody who's experienced problems myself, as somebody who's experienced problems with mental health, and how debilitating that can be for individuals, I would like to know what steps are putting in place to support those with mental health problems, both employees of the council and elected members. Thank you.
We have got an arrangement with Salford University in relation to members of staff and for councillors themselves, that if they do want to have a consultation, if they contact the HR department, they'll be given details of how to contact Salford University to have sessions with a counsellor. And whilst there'll be no cost associated with this, they will be invited to make a contribution, if they can afford it, to the university. But there are steps in place for people suffering from mental health problems and such stress that they can have consultations with Salford University. And of course we have our own in-house occupational health department as well.
Councillor Bill Hines. Councillor Tracy Kelly. Councillor Lancaster.
Councillor Lightner. Councillor Paul Wilson.
All right.
Thank you, Chair. In the last council meeting, we heard about how the change in the bin collections from fortnightly to once in 3 weeks has affected the recycling. I've noticed on the records in the year 2017 to 2018, we've had 1,567 tonnes of recyclable waste rejected due to it being deemed contaminated. And we get fined, depending on the recycle plant, we get fined over £300 per tonne. So even though we've increased recycling by a few thousand tonnes over the past few years, in one single year we seem to have been fined around £500,000. So what's wrong with our recycling scheme, and how are we gonna better it?
I'm going to ask for any further questions. So there is a further question. We'll take them all at once. Councillor Saunders.
Councillor Wilson as well.
Yes, right. Yeah.
Take the opportunity that Councillor Lancaster, who has responsibility for environment and community safety, tributes have been paid to Councillor Connor and his family, but particularly on behalf of our group as well. But as his two ward colleagues, obviously on a completely non-political basis, can I and Councillor Lightner offer our condolences? And can we say, again, non-politically, that we are more than happy to attend to any constituency business that he has for as long as he wishes, and that I have actually written to him making that offer. On a much lighter note, if I can just say to Councillor Lancaster, the Chair will know that it's a recent event that the ceremonial mayor held a race night. Though I couldn't attend, I did purchase a horse. I named it Weekly Bins, and by the divine will of God, it romped home. Sure, there's a divine sign there. And finally, we seem to be in the festive spirit already. Everybody seems to be saying how much they like each other. So in that spirit, Chair, and as this is the last meeting before the Christmas and Jewish Hanukkah period and so on, can I wish everybody, whatever they are celebrating over the next few weeks, that they have a wonderful festive season and a very happy New Year.
Thank you, Councillor Saunders. There's one other question from Councillor Paul Wilson.
Unfortunately, it's going to be a bit more dark question. This is around the funerals and the recent decision by the Council of Lancaster to work with Keynes Funeral Homes to provide low-cost funerals. It's often said by people, often, but people do say sometimes they can't afford to die. And certainly I have two residents who have struggled to obtain funerals at a low cost as well previously. On one occasion, their relative was in the morgue for 6 months. On the other occasion, and they were able to, it took them not long to raise finances. On another occasion, they had to set up a GoFundMe page to actually provide funerals. So everything we can do to actually provide lower cost funerals is great, and obviously supports those people in poverty. But I wondered why the decision was to work with one private provider and not work with all the providers, and what work can we do further to produce a greater range of affordable funerals for people. Thank you.
Councillor Lancaster.
We went out to tender, so we didn't just go to one tenderer. We went to all the funeral undertakers and actually asked them to tender for the service, and Keynes was the lowest, and the ones which we were satisfied provided a good service, and that's why the judgment was made that way. We've helped, as you know, in many occasions on looking at funeral services, particularly the Mayor referred to the children's services, which we've had, children's funerals. Low-cost arrangements we made there as well. So we do our utmost to try and influence others as well, to reduce some of their costs. But it's no use just us looking at what we've done in the past about the cost we charge as a local authority for the services we provide. We've got to try and deal with the people who actually provide other services like funeral undertakers to make sure that they're not being ripped off, quite frankly. When you look at some of the costs now of funerals, you're talking about £4,000 or £5,000 for a funeral. That is a massive figure for relatives to find. And it's something we ought to be looking at and are looking at, how we can drive down the cost with all funeral undertakers, not just a single one. But Keynes came in the best, and that's why they're there. And they did set up a number of offices as well within the city when they came into the contract. So my worry and concern at that time was that as a contractor, they haven't got a single office in Salford. They were operating from outside Salford. Now that's changed, and they actually co-located their offices, a number of offices in Salford. The one about contaminated bins. Well, the recycling rate increased. It's not as increased as good as I'd like it to be, but that recycling rate didn't include the contaminated waste. That's on top of it. If it hadn't been contaminated, we've had a far greater percentage than what we're showing. And I, quite frankly, are concerned about contaminated bins generally. I've argued that now we've got the new computer system in bin wagons, we ought to be making note, in which we are, of contaminated bins. and then they should be visited, the people who are contaminating those bins, and action taken against individuals having warned them about it's not an acceptable situation to have those contaminated bins, and you're not being fair to the rest of the citizens of Salford who are having to pay for that service. That has happened to a certain extent. The other thing which we've done in Salford alone, and it's not just a Salford problem, it's a Greater Manchester problem, we've actually put a couple of operatives at the site to check the loads when they reach the refuse disposal site, to actually take out items which we contaminate in those bins. Now that's a costly way of doing it, but it's saving us money, as actually having rejected bins is costing us far more, as you said. So there's a number of things we can do about contaminated bins. The other thing I want to ensure is that we stop the bins being left. You get the argument, well, I didn't contaminate the bins, they were left on the streets and somebody put the stuff in. Well, it shouldn't be left on the streets, that be on the day of collection, and we need to take action against people who are not, in my opinion, taking their bins in when they're required. I think Councillor Connor's situation, you got answered by the Mayor, so I have no comment on that. As regarding the safety, road safety, that doesn't come under me, so but I'm sure if there's a road safety issue, I will actually look into that. So on those points, that's all I've answered.
Thank you. Councillor Derek Antipas, lead member for planning and sustainable. Sorry. Karen Garrido. Can you please sit down, or can you leave the council chamber? There is a method. There is a method for you to speak. There is a method for you to speak. You haven't taken up the option. That is your problem, not ours. Thank you. Any further questions to answer us? Yes, Garrido.
Why are we residents having to do...
Excuse me. Can I just say, you've got councillors in here who can speak and ask the questions. I'm not a councillor for you. I'm a councillor. Sorry, can I just say? Right, can I just say, the reason I want to stand up and thank this council and Councillor Antipas for all the hard work that our officers did, and to say to the Secretary of State, thank you very much for turning down 600 houses on Broad Oak, which Peel actually put in. This was the second time we'd actually fought this, the second one. And I know that the officer spent a long time on it, and it is also, I have to say, without the residents and without the local community actually putting their support behind RAID, which is Residents Against Inappropriate Development, we would have been in a really, really difficult position. And I'd like to personally thank them and hope that Councillor Antipas and the council will thank them as well, because it wasn't just the officers. We spent a large amount of money. We raised a large amount of money, not from benefactors, but from individual people who gave £5, £1, and actually helped to support the thing. And I just want to say that we worked so hard. This has taken 10 years of my life, and I know Robin's life, to actually fight this The first appeal, we fought and we won. The second appeal, we again fought and we've won. And I think we've got 6 weeks, and fingers crossed, toes crossed, right, that Peel will take the hint and not look for a judicial review. I can't guarantee that because they have spent a lot of money up to now. But to all the residents from all over this city who supported us, can I say thank you very much, because this was a victory that was well won and well fought. And I'd just like to say, this sounds a bit funny from me, but thanks to Robin who did the advocacy, because we couldn't afford a QC or a solicitor. So Robin had to do it. There were some funny intervals, but we really worked very hard. And the number of speakers that we had impressed the inspector. We had doctors, we had individuals, we had members from the council, we had an officer who came to speak about birds. We had everybody, right, who actually turned up and spoke. And in fact, he'd said they'd never seen so many people, and he had to do 2 nights, and the hall was full the whole of the time. So thank you very much for fighting it, and thank you very much to the Secretary of State for actually going along with the council and the residents. Thank you.
Isn't it a shame that the residents have to take up action because of decisions taken by the planning committee which were flawed from the start?
Come, thank you. If the people in the public gallery, the protesters, if you just listen for 1 minute, please, we can meet you all in the main reception downstairs with officers to discuss the matters you brought to protest. If you want to speak to officers, we will speak to you in the reception downstairs. Thank you. No, you haven't. Right.
You've got 2 options. You can either move on or you can come with liberty.
Yeah.
It's nearly 5:30. Yeah.
If you want to meet people downstairs, the officers, they're willing to meet you. Now, as Councillor Antrobus.
Councillor Antrobus himself intimidated other members of the planning committee.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. If I can reply to Councillor Garrido and say that I very much welcome the decision of the Secretary of State to support the City Council's policy, and in my immediate response to the announcement, I did thank the support of the residents for the Council's policy. And of course, one of the important things about the Secretary of State's decision was that he gave substantial weight to the City Council's planning policy, EN2, which protects the Greenway. And I think that the important thing about that decision was a recognition of the vision of the people of the City of Salford at the time who put that condition on, because I'd like to pay special tribute to the vision of Ben Walsworth, now 99 years old, who saw the importance of that, not only for the people who live by that area, but also wanted to improve the accessibility of that area for the wider public of the City of Salford. And that's one of the reasons that why we've linked it up to the cycleways, and one of the reasons why in our local plan we will strengthen the protection of that area. And I'm absolutely delighted that we've been able to do that, and we will continue to try to preserve that area in the future.
Thank you. The meeting is now closed because it's 12:30. Well, it's 12:29, and if the people in the public gallery wish to meet the officers, they are available in reception area. Thank you.